time once again for Community Forum, and we are very lucky to have with us live in the studios this morning, Shon Meckfessel. Shon Meckfessel is author of 2 books, Suffoled How It Gush, a North American anarchist in the Balkans, and to talk about his latest book, which we aired a talk based on last Sunday during the drive, Nonviolence Ain't What It Used to Be, Unarmed, Insurrection, and the Rhetoric of Resistance. Shon, thank you very much for coming in and spending time with us this morning.
Thanks so much for having me on, Mike. It's an honor.
So start out, tell us what was the motivation in writing Nonviolence Ain't What It Used to Be?
Well, I found myself in graduate school and I was studying rhetoric, which is kind of how meanings are made, both within language and also kind of just within what we do. And at the same time, I was really active in Occupy Seattle. I was actually in Occupy Wall Street in New York for the first week. I was there for some other reasons and just decided to drop by this crazy Adbusters protest that was happening and had no idea what it was going to become. So I was around for New York, and then I came out and was pretty present from near the start of Occupy Seattle through the whole thing there in the camp almost every day. And I was also going down, I'm originally from Sacramento, California, so I was going down to visit family and friends in the meantime, and I was spending a lot of time in the Occupy Oakland camp as well. And for one thing, I noticed even at the time, and then certainly afterwards, a lot of the representations of that movement and that moment were focusing a lot on the kind of more New York approach, and we're leaving out the differences. There was a really marked difference in character between, I think between every camp reflecting the conditions of their cities, and also between particularly the kind of West Coast movements and the East Coast ones. And I found, the West Coast tend to have a lot sort of more thoroughgoing critique, where New York was, everything was happening, but I think the focus ended up being a lot on, banking policy, Glass-Steagall, regulations, that kind of thing on the East Coast, which is obviously important. But on the West Coast, it was kind of prefigurative of Black Lives Matter, I think, especially in Oakland. And also the means of the protest ended up kind of scrappier on the West Coast in some ways. So I was disappointed that wasn't being really recognized, that the differences. I was already kind of thinking that. But then really what made it a motive for me to kind of dive into and spend several years trying to come to understand was when we lost the camp, sort of mid-December, I think, December 10th or something, in Seattle. Within hours, this coalition of people who, we'd gone through hell together, we'd gone through this really crazy prolonged experience, all these kind of shared risks, shared a lot of pepper spray, a lot of scary moments at the hands of police batons, and, all night talking sessions in the camp. And, we had this sort of really intimate shared space. And then as soon as we lost that camp, within hours, we were just tearing each other apart, mostly online, which is notable, around this issue of nonviolence. And by the end of that conversation, I think within about 12 hours, the acrimony was so intense that most of those people kind of never talked to each other again. And so I was just trying to figure out, what is it about this topic that has is so charged, so bitter, that within hours it can just kind of turn people who, have all these maybe longer term shared concerns with the way things are going right now, it can turn them against each other so much that they can't even speak. And so I made it the topic of my doctoral research and spent the next 2 or 3 years actively interviewing people and, reading everything that I could find on the topic to kind of try to tease out where that tension was coming from.
Yeah, it definitely seems that the concept of nonviolence is the holy grail among the left. And you go through in your work numerous key people and their surprising definitions and or thoughts on nonviolence.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure I'd say it's the holy grail of the entire left. It's sort of a section of the kind of progressive liberal left, I think. For example, Maoists are hardly enamored of nonviolence. Maoists, actually, to the contrary, I think, talk a lot about guns and the Kalashnikovs and peasants in the third world rising up and overthrowing capitalism from the periphery. And actually what I found interesting, kind of got into, was that the prevalence of that idea, particularly in the moment of sort of in the shadow of Che Guevara in Cuba and, obviously the conflict of Vietnam, and people kind of coming to sympathize. I think a lot of people, as they came to be critical of the U.S. role in Vietnam, also sort of came to admire the armed struggle of the Vietnamese against American presence in the sort of more radical left or whatever. And so people kind of, I think, a lot of the images of left struggle were modeled based on those things. And of course, you had this wave of anti-colonial revolutions happening throughout Africa at about at that time, as well as some in East Asia. And so I think actually, so you have part of the left that was primarily inspired by, of course, Martin Luther King Jr. and Gandhi, and the civil rights moment. And then you had a different part of the left at that time that was inspired by more this kind of armed struggle vision. And that was the dichotomy that was kind of set at that time. That's not even saying that everybody at that time fit into that dichotomy, but that's kind of what made it into our public memory. And a lot of what I write about is that we still have that language, we still have that, we still have those categories that we're thinking in, but the present moment that we're in has fundamentally shifted in a lot of ways that doesn't really match that. So either in the way that nonviolence kind of plays out, and also in the ways that it's opposite, whatever you're going to think of as violence, kind of occurs now. Neither of those really fit the categories from a previous generation, but we're still using those concepts and those terms as if that's where we're at still.
One of the things you touched on in your talk that aired last week was two key people who have been on this show before in one form or another, George Lakey and Chenoweth, Erica Chenoweth, who we've aired her talk. And you had intriguing insights into both their work that I'm hoping you can touch on.
So I want to just kind of off the cuff make this distinction between, there's a distinction that I learned from a lot of nonviolent scholars between what people term kind of principled nonviolence and strategic nonviolence. And the principled nonviolence people, a lot of the time it's kind of like an article, it's sort of more like a religious expression or spiritual practice, and doesn't actually, there's a lot of people who espouse nonviolence where they're not actually claiming to kind of make a change in the world. So for example, I go back to Leo Tolstoy, and he actually says, you can't know the effects of your action. He says in his book, The Kingdom of God is Within You. He's saying you can't actually know the effect of your actions, so the best you can do is just sort of act out of your sense of duty, what feels right, and kind of hope for the best. And so there's a lot of people kind of from that sort of perspective who aren't looking at the effects of their actions, but they're doing it just because they don't want to be kind of enacting the violence that they see in the world. I'm not going to address that part as much because I think in terms of political strategy, the problems with that are obvious. You should be looking at the effects of your actions. So I'm much more interested in people who claim that nonviolence is, what they're calling nonviolence is the only or clearly most effective, exclusive way to actually make the changes in the world that we want to see. And they generally kind of like to call themselves strategic nonviolence people. I think George Lakey would call himself this, definitely Erica Chenoweth kind of identifies. Gene Sharp was a famous name in this that I talk about a lot too. And, they make some really valuable contributions. I think that all activists these days should be reading their work. Gene Sharp, for example, has this list of 198 methods of nonviolent action. I think those are mostly like really insightful, great tactics that I agree have kind of been behind a lot of the social changes. What I question about those people is usually why they would call what they're talking about nonviolent. Because, for example, Gene Sharp says that basically most of his methods of nonviolence kind of grouped together under protest, like demonstration, occupation, and strike, work stoppage. And it's only very abstractly that you can term those things nonviolent in effect when you're actually in conflictual situations and there's high stakes, and those aren't simply sort of symbolic. It inevitably involves some kind of at least implied threat of violence. And I think that's what's left out a lot of the time. So George Lakey, for example, talks about the uprising near kind of revolution in Paris, 1968, in May, that has really been epical for the sort of left since that moment, defines 1968 for a lot of people. And he says that, George Lakey says that it was mostly nonviolent because it began, admittedly, with a few struggles, a few street fights between students at the Sorbonne and police. And then it spread and the numbers got huge and there were a few more street fights. But for the most part, once there were millions of people out on the streets, and of course, there were workers and people across society came out after the initial struggles, then it was nonviolent. But the silly thing about that, of course, is that the open conflict, the sort of break with the everyday that happened through the students fighting with police was exactly the thing that brought everybody else out in the streets, right? So it wasn't incidental that involved, direct conflict. It was a very necessary first part of a much larger process. So that's one of the things I criticize as the sort of opportunistic definition. Erica Chenoweth, again, I admire her work. I think there's a lot of insights in it that are valuable, but I think what I pick on for her is, I can actually open my book here and make sure I quote her correctly. Chenoweth's work is famous, and she's still getting like front pages a lot of the time talking about how the right way to do this stuff and what works and what doesn't. And she did this quantitative study looking at something like 20,000 social conflicts and sort of seeing which conflicts got what they wanted and which didn't. And she said that, clearly the data shows that nonviolence works much better. I'm always just interested, because these definitions slide all over the place. What does she mean by nonviolence and by violence? And I said, I'm just going to open up here. Let's see, on page 13 of her book, she gives her definition of violence. She says, violent tactics include bombings, shootings, kidnappings, physical sabotage, such as the destruction of infrastructure, and other types of physical harm of people and property. So she's talking about any harm to people, which is pretty wide, and including and also any harm to property, she's defining as violence. And then her operational definition, she gives on page 16 of her book, where she's actually says the way that the data set that she's using defines, the difference between violence and nonviolence. She says the Corliss Award data set requires all combatant groups to be armed and to have sustained 1,000 battle deaths during the course of the conflict. So she's saying that violence means harming property, among other things, but the definition she's using for this data set that she uses as proof talks about 1,000 people getting killed with guns. Those are two really different things, and I think we have to distinguish between more subtle meanings that happen within these words, violence, nonviolence. So yeah, that's a lot of my critique. I really admire where they're coming from. I just don't know if they're talking about nonviolence when they think they are.
Intriguing. Another example you touch on is the poll tax in Britain when Margaret Thatcher was in power and the public response to that.
Yeah, so this is a really key definition that I think Gilles Deleuze said that we need to kind of proliferate distinctions, and I think it's a good habit that we could benefit more from. I think we lump things together too much. There's different kinds of violence, and those differences matter a lot. So I mentioned before this kind of like model that we inherited, especially from the early 70s, when, for example, you have the Weather Underground, and you had when Black Panthers faced repression, and a lot of them ended up murdered by the state or imprisoned, and some of the ones who continued went into the Black Liberation Army, which was more this kind of guerrilla guerrilla struggle model. That's a lot of what, especially people who were in living memory of that time, that's what people think of when they think violence. But for younger people, I'm like mid 40s. And so I found that people older than me who are kind of living memory of that, that's what's called to mind for them. And that's why so many people are like, I don't want that anymore. That was crazy. I'm nonviolent. They mean not that. People younger than me who are a little more distant from that, they think of a lot of the sort of passivity, the kind of institutionalization of dissent. I read about this in the first half of my book, the way that a lot of our means of kind of messing with stuff, which is ultimately where our power comes from, have been co-opted in the the 80s, 90s, thousands in this decade. And so a lot of younger people are trying to find their way out of that co-optation and find a way to actually be disruptive again. And I think that's why Occupy and Black Lives Matter have been, in a lot of ways, spectacularly successful at raising consciousness, opening space for the acknowledgement of their issues, just because they've kind of rediscovered disruption. So coming back a bit to what you asked with the poll tax riots, the sort of violence that we see in movements like Occupy and Black Lives Matter, and now some of the anti-Trump protests, has nothing to do with that idea of violence, quote unquote, from the kind of armed struggle thing. In fact, everybody I was talking to, out of the dozens of people I interviewed for my research, nobody was really had any kind of warm notions about guns as a way to sort of run out and change the world, right? We're still kind of talking about some sort of people power, but not necessarily the kind of conflict averse, nicey nice people power that nonviolence has come to often mean. So the poll tax riots were a really good example of that. They, of course, a bit of background, Margaret Thatcher, after 10 years of austerity, had kind of smashed the labor movement in Britain and, really enraged a lot of people, but there hadn't been, people kind of struggled on how to respond. And then finally they passed this sort of tax on the poor. And what happened was it brought out 100,000, 200,000 people into the streets of London. And those people were so enraged that there was a huge amount of kind of low-level violence. There was a lot of people who they walked past a police officer and elbow them, or they'd tip over a trash can or kick in a window when they walked past. And there was nothing like kind of, cells of militants who were going with a plan and carrying out something. It was just this really diffuse rage. And it ended up kind of turning London upside down. And what was clear from that, everybody knew it when they saw it, that it wasn't some marginal group that was out to, turn over the country or something, that it was really this general rage because of the nature of the violence, because it was so diffused of a large number of people doing a small amount of violence. It clearly kind of expressed sort of the will of a lot of people, and it ended up being so humiliating for Margaret Thatcher, she finally had to resign. That's what drove her out of office. So just like we're making distinctions sort of within nonviolence, we should be making distinctions within what we talk about as violence between, this sort of between guns and not guns, between concentrated kind of militant violence and a more diffuse kind of insurrectionary violence. And I think obviously you can tell the second is what I think we're seeing a lot more of right now.
So how have things changed or transformed with what we are seeing now? We have an extreme far right that is becoming very prominent, regularly covered in the news, and one of the responses is the anti-fascist movement that has sprung up across the country as well.
Yeah, lots to say. 8.5 minutes left. Well, I think it was Walter Benjamin who said that, when you have when you have this moment of social crisis and the left gets stomped, I'm not sure if those were his words, then people turn to the right because they still want answers. And I think that's what we're seeing now. After the repression that effectually brought to an end the mass mobilizations around Occupy, and at least has contained Black Lives Matter in some sense for now. A lot of people are kind of looking for answers. I think a lot of us still on the left are still there and thinking about stuff, but we've been kind of broken apart and demobilized for now. And the far right has really been mobilized by Trump's strange victory. So yeah, we're in a bad situation. I could talk a whole nother hours and hours about this one. I think this talk about Antifa is really interesting. I first want to point out that I kind of was writing about a different sort of left political violence in my book. I was looking at this moment of kind of anti-capitalist uprising, and I think it's different in some ways than anti-fascism. Anti-capitalist protest violence, I think, this sort of riots and this sort that we're talking about, my claim is that capitalism, the problem with capitalism is that it disrespects life, it destroys the earth and all these things, and it treats life as sort of disposable while it respects, it protects property. And anti-capitalist protest violence sort of does the opposite. It performs a disrespect for stuff, while actually, if you look at it, generally performs a respect for bodies. Even in these really crazy, huge uprisings with tons of property destruction, like you saw at the end of 2008 in Greece, there's actually very little violence kind of enacted on bodies. So that's something I write about a lot. Anti-fascism is different because fascists have bodies, and you have to sort of, if you're going to, you have to sort of target them in some ways. But I think people misunderstand, certainly when people equate anti-fascist violence with fascism, they're really, really missing the point. The nature of anti-fascist violence, I think, is the logic of it is to demobilize the power of fascist movements and leaders. And, unlike us on the left, unlike liberals and, all sorts of leftists, like we sometimes kind of like having that victim role. We kind of feel like feeling bad for ourselves. People only join up with fascism because they want to feel strong. It's usually aims at people who feel humiliated, who feel vulnerable. And, the very idea of a fasci behind fascism, it's a bundle of sticks, and it's like one stick alone can be broken, but together we are unbreakable. And so to perform this sort of, if you can, like the Richard Spencer getting punched video is a perfect example of this. If you can show vulnerability, if you can show that these people who are claiming to be the master race or, this new iron force in the world or something, if you can show that they're weak and show that they have, vulnerabilities also, it's not attractive and people don't want to join up. At the same time, I'm always saying, if the Richard Spencer video had been him getting hit in the head with a baseball bat, it probably wouldn't have been such a hit. People wouldn't have been remixing it to Whitney Houston, in New Order, if it'd been like bloody and if it looked like he'd been like maimed, right? So anti-fascist violence aims at the sort of sweet spot where we're demobilizing and kind of embarrassing the image of invulnerability that is the very core of fascism, right? It can't work without that. And at the same time, we're still not, I think in good moments, right? We're still not enacting injury or maiming or murder. Right now, already in, we're almost October 2017, we have a laundry list of people who've been murdered by the far right since the Trump election, right? There's a lot of people. It's not just Heather Heyer. Locally, Ben Keita, I still suspect down the line we're going to find out that was not a suicide. The 18-year-old black Muslim youth who was found hanging from a tree, like 30 feet rope. There's a lot happening. And so we see, when people talk about like establishing a white ethno state, like Richard Spencer says, when people talk about apologizing for, how slavery wasn't so bad, or people talk about building a wall and driving out Latino immigrants, when people talk about this kind of violent language, it ends up in violence against bodies, which is why I think we have to prevent it. Anti-fascist violence isn't, we don't have a laundry list of people who've been killed by anti-fascists or maimed or injured, right? It aims at embarrassing people's power, but not, I think, again, it's a bit inconsistent for anti-fascists to be enacting like egregious bodily harm. At some point it gets that bad, right? World War II got that bad, for example. I was in Czech Republic for a time when there was a back and forth of violence between fascists and anti-fascists, and people were basically shooting each other right and left, and activists were basically just spending all their time fundraising for medical and legal bills. So that can happen when things get very bad. I really, really hope it doesn't go that way. But it's really important in our moment. Things are nothing like that. Anti-fascism is basically trying to demobilize these very dangerous far-right networks that are starting, and trying to disrupt their organizing efforts, figure out what they're up to, and disrupt their public image so they don't have the appeal that brings new people in, and make them not a problem. And I think for that reason, like, we all should be active anti-fascists in whatever capacities we have.
All right, tough to do in just a minute and a half, but can you touch on real quick your thought on the free speech issue?
Yeah, I'd love to come back sometime and focus especially on that. I think we were speaking after an event I did at UW. So first of all, free speech, the constitutional law says Congress shall not prevent free speech. So if we show up and we're like, I don't want a person preaching genocide on my campus or in my neighborhood, and we don't let them talk, that's not against the First Amendment because I'm not Congress. The law doesn't say anything about that because it's dumb. If you say something offensive to somebody in a bar, like, they might not let you continue the conversation. That's how it works, right? So free speech doesn't mean we have to let anybody say whatever dumb stuff they want to say. It never says that. But also, even I'm a college teacher, and even like state institutions, they prevent speech all the time maybe for good reasons and for a lot of silly reasons. I think if you look at the Green Scare that happened 10, 15 years ago in the Northwest around ecological activists, anarchists in this region, I mean, people were locked up. I know people who were sentenced to 10, 20 years for things that they said that wasn't even threatening to harm people at all. So there's a real inconsistency that's going on. I urge people to look at, there's things like harassment, incitement to violence, anything that disrupts the material function of, say, universities. None of those things are actually protected speech under the law. So I think people are just kind of at a loss in this moment and don't know how to respond. But we have a lot of tools on all levels that we can be acting with to not accept the stuff that's happening. And I think when people shrug, throw up their shoulders and say, well, they have the right to free speech, they're just saying, like, they don't want to deal with it. The other thing is, I think people are really into, a lot of liberals are really into kind of showing how tolerant they are and being really proud, like, look how tolerant I am. I'm so open-minded. I can even let a Nazi, like, threaten my neighbor's life. But their tolerance is not the only thing that happened. We should really take seriously what words do. And we probably shouldn't. Karl Popper said, if we tolerate intolerance, if we tolerate people saying people should be driven out and some people don't belong here because of their race or their sexuality or something, we're actually enabling intolerance in a way that can kind of undermine the whole deal.
All right. Well, with that, we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you very much for coming and spending time with us this morning.
Thank you again, Mike, so much for having me.